The house was beautiful, but it didn't breathe. Every surface gleamed, yet nothing lived inside it. And for 2 long years, not a sound had escaped the lips of Blake Volt's children. The mansion rose above the Hudson like a glass fortress, built from precision and fear. It was everything Blake had ever designed, perfection framed in steel and silence. He'd drawn its lines himself. No clutter, no chaos, no unnecessary noise. Every angle caught light the way his mind once caught inspiration. But now, that same brilliance only reflected emptiness. Inside, the air smelled faintly of marble polish and sterile order. Floors too clean to touch. Rooms too vast to hold warmth. Somewhere on the 2nd floor, a set of tiny shoes sat by the door to a playroom filled with untouched toys. 2 of them, pink and white, never scuffed, never used. Blake stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands locked behind his back. The morning skyline sprawled before him, cold and endless. The world still called him the architect of emotions, a genius who designed buildings that made people feel. But that was irony's cruelest joke, because inside this house, he couldn't even reach his own children. Somi and Sonia, 6 years old, twins who had once filled his mornings with laughter, songs, and tiny arguments over cereal colors. Until the accident. Until the night the world folded in half. Since that night, the twins hadn't spoken. Not to each other. Not to him. Not to anyone. He'd done what billionaires do when life breaks. He threw money at the silence. Doctors, specialists, neurologists, behaviorists, therapists. Each one came with polished shoes and clinical hope, carrying glossy charts and sterile smiles. Each one left defeated, mumbling words like trauma regression and neurological shutdown. Blake turned away from the window. His reflection followed him, tall, severe, tired. His once black hair now streaked with silver, his jaw always tight, as if emotion were an enemy he refused to surrender to. He moved through the halls in silence. Cameras blinked from corners. Subtle, discreet, designed to make him feel in control. But the truth was, the man who had designed skyscrapers that touched heaven couldn't rebuild 2 little hearts shattered by loss. On the living room wall hung a photograph. A woman with gentle eyes, her arms wrapped around the twins. Sophia Volt, his late wife. The smile on her face had once anchored him. Now it haunted every room. He stopped before the picture, his chest tightening in the familiar ache. The one that came before the anger, before the guilt. "Good morning, sir." The voice came from the doorway. Mrs. Dallow, the house manager. She'd been with the family for 10 years. Efficient and loyal. Never intrusive. "There's someone here to see you. About the nanny position." Blake didn't turn. His eyes stayed fixed on the photo. "We've tried 6. "Yes, sir. And none lasted longer than a week." "I understand, sir. But this one." She came highly recommended. He finally turned. "By who?" Mrs. Dallow hesitated. "The community center downtown. She used to volunteer with children there." He frowned. "So not a specialist?" "No, sir. Not a therapist, not a behavioral consultant, not a licensed." "No, sir. Just Grace." Grace arrived that afternoon. Unnoticed at first, quiet as a whisper. The staff barely looked up when she entered, carrying nothing but a small worn bag and a folded resume. She was younger than Blake expected, maybe early 30s, with warm brown skin and soft eyes that seemed to understand more than she said. Her clothes were simple, pressed, clean, but nothing designer. And yet, there was something about her presence that unsettled the sterile perfection of the room. She smiled, just once, and for a fleeting second, the air felt softer. Blake looked up from his tablet when she entered his office. His first thought, too ordinary. His second, too calm. "Mr. Volt," she said quietly. "Thank you for seeing me." Her voice carried a steady rhythm. Not nervous, not rehearsed, just real. He nodded, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "You've seen the listing?" "I have." "And you're aware this position requires full residence?" "I am." "And that it involves specialized care for 2 children with significant developmental trauma?" "Yes." He studied her face, searching for fear or hesitation. There was none. Only that calm, grounded presence again. It irritated him, though he couldn't say why. "Tell me," he said finally, "what makes you think you're qualified?" Grace's eyes lifted, meeting his without flinching. "Because I don't treat children like cases, Mr. Volt. I treat them like people." The words landed in the air, simple and bold. He blinked, not used to being spoken to in that tone, not defiant but clear. She continued gently, "I don't have fancy degrees, but I've worked with children who didn't speak, children who didn't move, and I've learned that sometimes the silence isn't the sickness. It's the protection." Something inside him tightened. Anger, maybe, or fear. He looked away. "You think you can do what trained experts couldn't?" Grace didn't answer that. She only said, "I can try, if you'll let me." The room held a long silence. Then, with the faintest exhale, he nodded. "You'll start tomorrow." Grace began quietly. She didn't bring noise into the house. She brought presence. In her first morning, she moved through the halls without disturbing the stillness, humming under her breath as she unpacked her things. The melody was soft, almost like a prayer. Somi and Sonia watched her from behind a doorway, two fragile faces peeking from shadows, curiosity hidden under caution. Grace didn't chase them. She only smiled, then turned back to her work, arranging small paper cranes on the kitchen counter. Little by little, she folded them, each one more colorful than the last, until the white marble gleamed with a burst of living color. Later that day, Blake saw them. He paused, staring at the bright paper birds scattered across his minimalist kitchen. "What is this?" he asked sharply. Grace, who was wiping the counter, didn't look up. "A welcome," she said softly. "For the girls. They don't touch toys." "They don't have to," Grace replied. "They just need to see something that isn't afraid to be alive." He stared at her, baffled by her calm audacity. "Alive?" "Yes," she said, looking up finally. "This house feels like it's waiting for permission to breathe again." He said nothing, but that night, when he passed the kitchen, one of the paper cranes was gone. It happened slowly, so slowly that Blake almost missed it. A faint sound one morning, not a word, not even a laugh, just a breath, a startled exhale from behind the playroom door. Grace was inside, sitting cross-legged on the floor, building a tower of wooden blocks. Sonia sat opposite her, watching. Somi stood nearby, fingers clutching the edge of the table. Grace didn't speak. She hummed again that same quiet tune. And every time she placed a block, she looked up at Sonia and smiled, waiting, inviting. Then, softly, Sonia reached forward and placed a block too. It fell. Grace laughed. A real laugh. Soft and human. Sonia froze, startled by the sound, by the warmth of it. Then Somi giggled. Just once. The sound was tiny and unsure, but it was a sound. Blake, watching from the doorway, felt something collapse inside his chest. 2 years of silence, broken not by science, not by therapy, but by a woman humming in his playroom and laughing when blocks fell. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Shame, sharp and suffocating, burned behind his ribs. He had spent millions to fix what she'd touched with nothing but a song. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds as if it, too, was tired of hiding. Thin light streamed across the marble floor, slipping through the glass walls and touching the edges of the playroom where Grace sat again, humming. The twins waited this time. They no longer hovered behind the door. Somi crept closer, her tiny toes brushing the rug, her hands clutching a stuffed rabbit whose ears were worn thin. Grace didn't speak. She simply smiled, lowering her voice into a softer hum that carried the rhythm of a heartbeat. Steady, patient, alive. She tapped the floor gently with her palm, keeping time, inviting Somi to follow. When Somi's small hand landed on the floor with a faint thump, Grace's smile widened, as if someone had handed her a treasure. From the hallway, Blake paused. He hadn't meant to stop. He was on his way to a conference call, already late, phone buzzing in his pocket. But that sound, tiny, hesitant, alive, rooted him to the spot. Grace caught sight of him but didn't stop humming. Instead, she shifted her tone slightly, turning it into a wordless tune that made Sonia tilt her head. The twins' eyes met for the first time in months. They both tapped the floor together, once, twice, then burst into shy laughter before retreating behind their hands. Blake swallowed hard. Something behind his stern composure trembled. He turned away quickly, as if the moment had caught him doing something forbidden. Later that evening, when the house settled into its usual hush, he found himself reviewing the security footage from the playroom. He told himself it was professional curiosity, a father's duty to monitor his children's progress. But deep down, he knew it was something else. A need to understand how a stranger could unlock what he, with all his money and intellect, could not. The screen flickered with color as the recording played. Grace sitting cross-legged, the girls beside her, 3 figures wrapped in a quiet melody. It looked almost wholly ordinary objects transformed into instruments of healing. The blocks, the hum, the warmth. His jaw tightened. Shame burned hot under his collar. What if she's wrong? What if she breaks them again? The thought struck him like panic disguised as logic. He shut the laptop with a sharp click. Grace found him in the kitchen later, pacing with a glass of untouched scotch. "They responded to you," he said abruptly. His tone wasn't gratitude, it was interrogation. Grace looked up from the sink where she was rinsing dishes. "Yes, they did." "What did you do?" "I listened." He frowned. "You sang." "I hummed." "Without permission." Grace dried her hands slowly, folding the towel with deliberate calm. "Do I need permission to be kind?" His brow furrowed. "This isn't a classroom, Miss Grace. My children aren't a charity project. They're fragile." "They're children," she interrupted gently. The firmness in her voice startled him. "Fragile, yes, but also strong. You keep treating them like they'll break if the world touches them. But maybe the world is what they need to remember they're still here." He stared at her, words trapped somewhere between pride and disbelief. No one spoke to him this way, not board members, not doctors, not anyone. Her gaze softened. "They don't need perfection, Mr. Volt. They need warmth. Joy isn't reckless. It's the only thing they've been starved of." The sentence landed like a hammer against glass. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between them. Finally, Blake exhaled. "You've said enough for tonight." Grace nodded, unshaken. "Good night, sir." When she left, he remained standing there, glass still in hand, feeling as though the walls themselves were listening. The screen flickered with color as the recording played. Grace sitting cross-legged, the girls beside her, 3 figures wrapped in a quiet melody. It looked almost wholly ordinary objects transformed into instruments of healing. The blocks, the hum, the warmth. His jaw tightened. Shame burned hot under his collar. What if she's wrong? What if she breaks them again? The thought struck him like panic disguised as logic. He shut the laptop with a sharp click. Grace found him in the kitchen later, pacing with a glass of untouched scotch. "They responded to you," he said abruptly. His tone wasn't gratitude, it was interrogation. Grace looked up from the sink where she was rinsing dishes. "Yes, they did." "What did you do?" "I listened." He frowned. "You sang." "I hummed." "Without permission." Grace dried her hands slowly, folding the towel with deliberate calm. "Do I need permission to be kind?" His brow furrowed. "This isn't a classroom, Miss Grace. My children aren't a charity project. They're fragile." "They're children," she interrupted gently. The firmness in her voice startled him. "Fragile, yes, but also strong. You keep treating them like they'll break if the world touches them. But maybe the world is what they need to remember they're still here." He stared at her, words trapped somewhere between pride and disbelief. No one spoke to him this way, not board members, not doctors, not anyone. Her gaze softened. "They don't need perfection, Mr. Volt. They need warmth. Joy isn't reckless. It's the only thing they've been starved of." The sentence landed like a hammer against glass. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between them. Finally, Blake exhaled. "You've said enough for tonight." Grace nodded, unshaken. "Good night, sir." When she left, he remained standing there, glass still in hand, feeling as though the walls themselves were listening. Days passed, and the mansion began to change in ways too subtle for words. The staff whispered about it. The faint music drifting from the playroom, the laughter echoing down the hallways like sunlight returning to forgotten rooms. Grace brought color back one object at a time. Paper cranes, chalk drawings on the patio, bowls of fruit left half peeled because Sonia liked the smell of oranges. Somi began to crawl under tables, hiding tiny treasures, buttons, feathers, marbles, like she was collecting proof that the world was real again. Blake tried to maintain distance. He still rose before dawn, still buried himself in blueprints and meetings, still insisted that routine was control. Yet every night he found himself pausing by the twins' door, listening to their soft giggles through the crack. One evening he pushed the door open slightly. Grace was telling them a story, not from a book but from memory. Her voice wove through the room like silk. Once upon a time, she said, there was a house that forgot how to breathe. The wind passed by its windows. The sun touched its walls. But inside, everything stayed still. Until one day, two little lights were born inside it. Sonia whispered something too soft to catch. Grace leaned closer, smiling. What was that, sweetheart? The whisper came again. A breath, a shape, almost a word. Blake's chest tightened. He wanted to hear it clearly, but fear held him frozen. He eased the door shut before she could notice him. That night, he didn't touch his scotch. He sat in his study staring at the photograph of Sophia again, wondering if somewhere she could see this, see their daughters beginning to live again because of another woman's warmth. The thought filled him with gratitude, and guilt so deep it nearly broke him. The following morning, the mansion woke early. Dr. Lydia Penrose arrived like a gust of cold air, sharp suit, silver glasses, the scent of rain still clinging to her coat. Her handshake was firm, her smile professional but thin. Mr. Volt, she said, I understand you've been working with a new caretaker? Blake nodded slowly. Grace. Penrose's eyes flicked toward the kitchen, where Grace was helping the twins finish breakfast. Her gaze lingered too long, calculating, almost invasive. And what are her credentials? She's not a licensed specialist, Blake replied, defensive without meaning to be. She's different. The doctor smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Different can be dangerous. Grace looked up just then, catching the edge of the conversation. Her face stayed composed, but her hand tightened slightly on the counter. Penrose continued, lowering her voice. I reviewed the footage from the monitoring system you approved last year. Some of the activity patterns are unusual. Blake frowned. Unusual how? Lights on at odd hours. Rooms used outside the children's routines. Vocal frequencies recorded late at night. Nonverbal humming. Rhythmic patterns. Blake blinked. You're saying I'm saying, Penrose interrupted smoothly, that you might not know who this woman really is. Her tone wasn't dramatic. It was clinical, precise. That made it worse. Blake's mind flicked back. Grace arriving with no references, the worn bag, the confidence, the way she seemed to know exactly what the twins needed before they asked. When he looked up again, Grace was gone from the kitchen. He found her outside, standing beneath the drizzle near the garden. The rain had flattened her hair, but she didn't seem to notice. She was humming again, softly, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Grace, he said sharply. She turned. Yes, Mr. Volt? You've been here less than a month. And somehow, I'm hearing reports that you've been active during the night, that you've accessed rooms you weren't assigned. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Reports from who? He hesitated. Dr. Penrose. The surveillance flagged movement. Grace's voice dropped lower. You still keep cameras in the children's play area? He stiffened. For their safety. For your control, she corrected gently. But there was steel under her tone this time. Mr. Volt, what exactly do you think you're protecting them from? The world? Or yourself? Her words sliced through him. You don't understand, he said quietly. After Sophia, after the accident, Grace took a step closer. Then tell me, what happened that made you build a prison out of glass? He looked away, jaw tight. The rain thickened, each drop striking the marble path like tiny accusations. When he finally spoke, his voice broke slightly. The twins were in the car. Sophia was driving. I was supposed to be with them, but I stayed behind to finish a design pitch. A client worth billions. I thought I had time. Grace's face softened, pain flickering behind her calm. The truck hit them, he continued, head on. Sophia didn't make it. The twins survived, but they stopped moving, stopped speaking. The doctors said they saw her die. Silence. Only rain. Grace's eyes shimmered. And you've been trying to fix them ever since. He nodded slowly. Mr. Volt, she said, voice trembling but steady. They don't need fixing. They need permission to feel again. And so do you. Something unspoken passed between them. A pull, raw and frightening. For the first time in years, Blake didn't feel like the man in control. From the kitchen window, Dr. Penrose watched them. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned to Mrs. Dallow and murmured, "Keep her under observation. This kind of emotional dependency is dangerous." Mrs. Dallow hesitated. "But the children, Penrose said, slipping on her gloves, are responding to a method we don't understand, and that always ends badly." Inside the garden, Grace turned back toward the twins' laughter echoing faintly through the open door. For the first time, she looked uneasy. She glanced toward the mansion's windows, toward the unseen eyes watching her, and whispered under her breath, almost like a warning to herself, "Not again." Morning came like a hesitant breath over the Volt estate. Pale sunlight crawled through floor-to-ceiling glass, turning the marble floors into shifting rivers of gold. The house that had once been a fortress of order now felt different. Lighter somehow, as if someone had quietly opened a window in its soul. Grace was that window. She moved through the mansion like a melody the walls had forgotten, soft footsteps, low humming, an energy that didn't match the sterile perfection of Blake's world. She had been there only 2 weeks, yet her touch was everywhere. Tiny fingerprints of warmth that money couldn't buy. There were fresh tulips in the kitchen, hand-cut fruit instead of sealed organic trays, and somewhere near the back patio, soft chalk drawings appeared. Circles and suns, like color finally dared to breathe again. But the true change was quieter. Sonia now looked up when Grace entered the room. Somi, once curled tight as a shell, sometimes followed her with his eyes. They didn't speak, not yet, but their silence had shifted from fear to waiting. And Grace could feel it, like standing before a door that might, at any moment, open. She didn't push. She never did. She simply was there, talking to them as if they had always answered. "Good morning, my little stars," she said each sunrise, her voice carrying a rhythm that felt safe. "Did you sleep well? The sky's clear today. It's a good day for dreams." Her words were not meant to fix. They were meant to fill the space. Blake noticed, though he pretended not to. He still spent his days in his glass office upstairs, blueprinting skyscrapers no one would ever live in, or staring too long at unfinished models. Projects that felt like monuments to control. But in the quiet hours, he found himself distracted by faint sounds he hadn't heard in years. A soft laugh, a wooden spoon clattering against a bowl, a child's light footsteps running. He caught himself pausing mid-drawing, pen hovering above paper. He would blink, shake his head, and force himself back to the structure, lines, angles, perfection. Yet something about that laughter, it struck a chord he couldn't silence. Grace's methods weren't normal. That much he could tell. He'd hired therapists, neurologists, and speech pathologists, people who charged $10,000 a session and spoke in terms like neuroplasticity and selective mutism. Grace didn't use charts. She used stories. She told them tales while cooking, of her grandmother's garden in Georgia, of fireflies that carried lost wishes, of lullabies that could calm storms. She sang, not loudly, but enough to make the air shimmer. And one night something happened. It began in the kitchen. Grace had poured dish soap into a small bowl, mixed it with sugar water, and dipped a ring through the liquid. When she lifted it, the air filled with trembling circles of light, bubbles, rising toward the skylight. Sonia froze mid-step. Somi's eyes widened. The children stood transfixed as a rainbow shimmered across the surface of a floating sphere. Grace whispered. See that? That's what hope looks like. Fragile, but it keeps rising if you let it. The twins didn't respond, but their gaze never left the bubbles. Somi's lips parted, a tiny breath escaping. A sound so faint it was almost lost. Blake was watching. He hadn't meant to. He'd come down for coffee, his usual armor of precision and silence intact. But through the doorway he saw them. Grace standing in sunlight, laughter dancing in her eyes, and his children alive. Not cured, not fixed, but alive. A strange heat crawled into his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't peace. It was something he hadn't felt in years. Something that hurt because it was real. The bubble burst with a soft pop, leaving a wet circle on Sonia's cheek. Grace wiped it gently, smiling. That one was just practice, she said, blowing another. Blake took a half step back, retreating into shadow. He felt intrusive, even unworthy. Yet he couldn't look away. For years, his mansion had been a mausoleum of achievements, trophies of intellect, not connection. Now, one ordinary woman had done something science never could. He closed the door silently and walked upstairs. But he didn't return to his desk. He sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, and for the first time, whispered into the silence. What did I miss? Downstairs, Grace kept blowing bubbles. And in the hush between pops, something small, miraculous, and fragile began to shift. Sonia reached out, caught one on her fingertip, and didn't let it go. Blake didn't sleep that night. He told himself it was the noise, the faint echo of laughter that drifted up from the lower floors. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't the sound that kept him awake. It was what it stirred inside him. For the first time in years, his children had smiled. And it hadn't been because of any of the experts he'd paid, or the strategies he'd approved. It had been because of her, Grace, the woman he'd almost dismissed as an act of desperation. He didn't like how that made him feel. Helpless, unnecessary, exposed. By morning, he had convinced himself it was dangerous. This chaos, this lack of structure. Joy wasn't a treatment plan. It wasn't measurable, predictable, or sustainable. It was reckless. He found Grace in the kitchen, her back to him, sleeves rolled to her elbows as she kneaded dough. Music hummed from the small radio beside her. An old gospel tune that didn't belong in a place like this. The twins sat nearby on the counter, their hands covered in flour, eyes wide with concentration as they copied her movements. For a moment, Blake just watched. He didn't mean to. There was something hypnotic in the way Grace worked, like every motion carried intent. Her hands moved with rhythm, not precision. She wasn't building anything. She was feeling it into being. He cleared his throat. The room froze. Grace turned slowly, the sunlight glinting off the flour on her face. The twins looked at him, first with stillness, then with that fragile, flickering fear he knew too well. Blake's voice came out lower than he expected. What exactly is this? Grace blinked, confused. Bread. I can see that. His tone sharpened. What I mean is, what is this? This routine. This unapproved activity. Soap bubbles. Songs. Now this. He gestured toward the flour-covered twins. You're supposed to be following their specialist's plan. The last thing they need is confusion. Then, with devastating simplicity, she said, Joy isn't reckless, sir. It's the only thing they've been starved of. He wanted to shout, to argue, but the words refused to come. Behind her, Sonia reached out, tugging gently at Grace's sleeve, her small fingers brushing the fabric as if to say don't stop. Grace turned, smiled faintly, and wiped flour from the girl's cheek. Then she picked up the dough again and began to knead, slowly, rhythmically, like nothing had happened. The children followed her lead, their small hands pressing softly into the warm surface. Blake stood there, watching the impossible scene unfold. The calm after a storm he didn't understand. He should have fired her. He knew that. But something in her quiet defiance unsettled him, like looking at an equation that refused to make sense. He left without another word. Yet that night, when he checked the security feed, because he always did, He found himself staring at the grainy black and white footage of the kitchen. Grace was still there, long after midnight, cleaning up alone. She paused at the counter, looked toward the camera, no, through it, and whispered something he couldn't hear. Then she smiled, small and weary, and turned off the light. For reasons he couldn't name, Blake replayed that moment 3 times before shutting his laptop. The following morning began like a whisper that refused to fade. A dense mist rolled over the Volt estate, softening the skyline of New York in the distance. The glass mansion stood in silence, its sharp edges blurred by fog, as if the world itself had decided to hide it from view. Grace arrived in the kitchen early, as she always did, humming beneath her breath. She was quieter than usual, though, her movements slower, deliberate. She could still feel the weight of Blake's voice from the day before, each word landing like a verdict. But what she didn't know was that Blake, too, hadn't slept. He had spent most of the night pacing between the library and his office, his thoughts colliding in uncharted directions. Grace's words haunted him. Joy isn't reckless. It's the only thing they've been starved of. He wanted to dismiss them as sentimental nonsense, but deep down they had burrowed in. He thought of the day of the accident, of the way silence had devoured the house afterward, how the twins' laughter had vanished overnight, replaced by blank stares and soft, shuddering breaths. He'd promised himself he'd never let chaos touch them again. But what if control had only turned their fear into concrete? He was still in that thought when the intercom buzzed. "Sir," his head of security said, "there's someone at the gate. Says she's from Child Services." Blake's pulse spiked. At this hour? She insists it's urgent. Ace had just finished helping Somi tie his shoelaces when the heavy doors opened. A woman stepped inside. Slim, sharp-featured, her expression precise. She wore a gray suit and carried a clipboard like a weapon. "Mr. Volt," she greeted, voice clipped. "Dana 4th, Child Services. We received a report of unauthorized behavioral intervention being conducted on your children." Grace froze. Blake blinked, the words landing one by one. "A report?" "Yes. It seems a member of your staff, Ms. Grace Thompson, has been implementing unapproved therapeutic practices. Singing, sensory exercises, unregulated play therapy. Do you confirm this?" Blake's throat went dry. He glanced at Grace. She stood perfectly still, her eyes wide but calm, hands clasped before her apron. "I assure you," he began, "my children are receiving the highest level of professional." The woman cut him off. "Then you'll have no objection to an on-site evaluation." The twins had gone silent, watching from the staircase. Sonia's thumb pressed against her lip, a nervous tremor running through her tiny body. Somi's fingers found his sister's hand, squeezing tight. Grace knelt and whispered something to them, a soundless reassurance, and they stayed still. Dana 4th began her inspection like an auditor, taking notes on every detail. She observed the twins, asked Grace curt questions about her qualifications, her background. "I was a nurse's aide before this," Grace said evenly. "And before that, I worked overseas for a time." "In what capacity?" Grace hesitated. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment. "Humanitarian aid." 4th raised a brow. "Specify." "Refugee camps," Grace replied softly. "South Sudan. I worked with children who'd lost their families. Many of them hadn't spoken in months." The air shifted. Even Blake felt it. 4th scribbled something down. "That may explain your unconventional approach." Grace's gaze remained steady. "It's the only approach that worked." The inspection continued, dragging tension through every hallway. The twins clung to Grace's side, their small bodies trembling at the stranger's clipped tone. When the woman finally left, the silence she left behind felt heavier than before. Grace exhaled slowly, leaning against the counter. "Someone reported me," she said quietly. Blake's jaw clenched. "Who would?" "Doesn't matter," she interrupted, eyes dim. "They'll be back. And next time, they might not just come with questions." Her voice held something new, steel beneath the softness. Blake studied her, noticing the faint scar near her wrist, the practiced calm in her posture. It wasn't the calm of someone who'd never known fear. It was the calm of someone who'd learned to stand inside it. "You said you worked in refugee camps," he murmured. "But that's not all, is it?" Grace met his gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "I used to do field extractions," she said quietly. "Medical evacuations. Children mostly. We learned to stay unseen, to make chaos feel safe until help arrived." He stared at her. "Why leave that world?" Her eyes softened. "Because I couldn't save them all. And I started believing I wasn't enough." The words struck like lightning because they were his too. Outside, thunder cracked. The storm that had been gathering all morning finally broke. Rain hammered against the windows, a sudden roar that made Sonia flinch. Grace reached for her, wrapping an arm around the girl's shoulders. "It's okay," she whispered. "Storms talk loud, but they don't mean harm." And then it happened. Somi, who hadn't spoken a word in years, turned toward his sister and whispered, barely audible, "Bubbles." The word was small, fragile, but it shattered the silence like glass. Grace's breath caught. Blake froze mid-step. Sonia looked at her brother, eyes wide, then turned to Grace, trembling. Grace smiled, tears already gathering. "Yeah, baby," she whispered, voice breaking. "Bubbles." Somi's lip trembled, and for the first time he smiled. In that instant, Blake felt the ground shift beneath him. The logic, the control, the architecture of his entire world, all of it cracked under the weight of a single whispered word. He looked at Grace, at his son, at the soft miracle unfolding before his eyes. And for the first time since the accident, the billionaire architect realized he wasn't the one building anything anymore. The mansion felt smaller that morning. Rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and glistening. Blake walked down the marble hallway, hands in his pockets, mind restless. The laughter from the playroom had faded into soft murmurs, replaced by an uneasy quiet. Then the call came. "Mr. Volt." Mrs. Dallow's voice trembled through the intercom. "It's Dr. Penrose. She's on her way. She insists it's urgent." Blake's chest tightened. He knew what this meant. Penrose had returned not for evaluation. She had come to enforce authority, to strip Grace from his children. Grace appeared behind him, calm as ever. Yet there was a subtle tension in her shoulders. "We can handle this," she said quietly, almost to herself. Blake wanted to argue. Logic, control, contracts, everything he knew how to wield was useless here. He swallowed. "We have to protect them." Outside, a sleek black car rolled into the driveway. Penrose stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, two uniformed officers emerged, silent and professional. The sense of intrusion was almost physical. Inside, the twins clung to Grace's legs. Somi hid his face against her apron. Sonia peered around cautiously. Blake approached, feeling exposed, powerless. "This isn't necessary," he said firmly. "They're safe." Penrose's lips curved in a thin smile. "Mr. Volt, safety is not a feeling. It's a procedure. And your children are receiving unapproved interventions." Grace stepped forward, placing herself between the twins and Penrose. "They're not interventions. They're life. And I won't let you take that away." Blake felt his chest tighten, the familiar fire of control battling with the unfamiliar ache of surrender. For months, he had believed he could fix everything with rules, schedules, and surveillance. Now, he realized all of that had been futile. A sharp rap on the doorframe startled everyone. One of the officers had entered, scanning the room. Blake felt a cold realization. He couldn't negotiate with this authority. Every procedural argument, every contract clause, it would mean nothing if his children's trust was on the line. Grace whispered to the twins, "Stay close. Breathe. Trust me." She turned to Blake. "It's your choice, Blake. You can cling to control, or you can do what's right." The moment of choice pressed on him like water. He could feel the weight of every decision he'd made since the accident. The endless doctors, the isolation, the silence that had consumed their lives. And now, the truth he had refused to see for years was undeniable. He needed her. He stepped forward, closing the space between them. "Do whatever you must," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I trust you." Grace nodded once, tightly, then turned to face Penrose. "If you want to remove them, you'll have to get past me first." The officer's hand twitched toward his radio. Blake's pulse spiked. Something in Grace shifted. The calm, almost maternal energy she carried now sharpened into readiness. Blake felt fear and awe collide inside him. This woman, his children's savior, the one he'd almost dismissed, was more than she seemed. Outside, thunder rolled, and the storm wasn't over yet. Inside, he knelt beside his children, letting the first tears in years fall freely. Somi and Sonia clung to him, trembling. Blake whispered, voice breaking, "I'm here. I'm not leaving." Grace's hands hovered above the twins. Ready. And for the first time, the billionaire felt the fragile pulse of life beating back at him. Not from control, but from trust. Grace didn't flinch. Instead, she reached behind her, producing a small black satchel she had carried since her first day. Blake tensed. He didn't know what she had in there, nor did he want to. The officers moved closer. One raised a hand to block Grace. She inhaled. And then, in a fluid motion that made Blake's chest constrict with awe and fear, she produced something entirely unexpected. A collapsible toolkit, wires, and small devices. Not weapons, not threats, but instruments, tools of extraction. Blake's mind raced. What is she doing? Grace moved toward the back door, her hands steady, fingers deft. She whispered, almost to the twins, "Stay close. Follow my lead." Sonia clutched her sister's hand. Somi gripped Blake's coat. The officers hesitated, unsure, as Grace's calmness radiated authority. "Sir," Penrose barked, "step aside. This is not." Grace ignored her. She moved like a shadow, dismantling the lock mechanism with surgical precision. Within seconds, the door clicked open. Rain sprayed inside, cold and wild, but Grace's focus was absolute. Blake's chest constricted. He realized she had trained for moments like this. Not hospital rooms, not kitchens, not gentle songs, but crises. Moments where every life depended on speed, stealth, and courage. "Dad," Somi whispered, almost inaudible. "Bubbles." The word hit Blake like a thunderclap. His heart seized. In the chaos, the memory of Grace blowing soap bubbles in the kitchen, the first tiny spark of life his children had shown in years, flashed before him. This is why they trust her. This is why I trust her. The officers moved closer again. One tried to step toward the twins. Grace's hand shot out, steady, stopping him mid-motion. "Do not touch them," she said, voice calm but steel sharp. "This is over before it even starts." A tense silence fell. Then, slowly, Blake stepped forward, placing himself behind Grace. "I'm with her," he said, voice low. "Do not interfere." Penrose's eyes narrowed. "You're defying protocol." "Yes," Blake admitted, chest tight, throat raw. "And I will do it again. I trust her with my children. You have no right here." The storm rattled louder, almost as if echoing his defiance. Grace moved quickly, ushering the twins toward a side door that led to the service exit. Blake followed, keeping a steady hand on each child. In those moments, Blake felt something he hadn't in years. Surrender. Not weakness, not failure, but clarity, trust, love, and courage, all intertwined. He didn't understand the full scope of Grace's past, nor did he need to. They reached the service door. Grace paused, checking the hallway before signaling them out. Outside, the rain drenched everything, washing away the immaculate perfection of Blake's estate. For a heartbeat, the world felt unsteady, chaotic, dangerous, and yet alive. Sonia whispered again, "Mama G." Blake froze. The words weren't just uttered. They were claimed, named, a bond declared. Grace turned, tears mingling with rain, and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "I'm here." Blake's chest ached, a mixture of relief, love, and awe. He knelt, gathering both children into his arms. For the first time in years, he didn't plan, calculate, or control. He held. Penrose and the officers hesitated at the doorway. The choice had been made. The family, unconventional, messy, alive, stood united. Grace whispered to Blake, "You see now, don't you? Life doesn't follow blueprints." He nodded, words failing him, tears streaming freely. And for the first time, Blake Volt understood that survival, love, and trust were far more powerful than any structure he could ever design. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the mansion and garden glistening like a crystal city. Blake led the twins through the service exit into the open air, the scent of wet earth filling the space where control and perfection had once ruled. Sonia skipped ahead, eyes wide with wonder, her tiny fingers brushing the droplets. Somi followed closely, his hand firmly clasped in Blake's. He looked at Grace and whispered, a word he had never said aloud before, "Bubbles." The word hung in the air, fragile yet triumphant. Grace knelt, her hands cupping his face. "Yes, Somi, Bubbles." Blake watched, heart tightening with awe. The children laughed together for the first time in years, a sound that rose and fell like wind over the city. A pure, unstructured melody. He fell to his knees beside them, arms opening, chest heaving, tears streaming freely. I see you," he whispered. "I'm here." Grace smiled faintly, her hands brushing the children's hair. "It's okay," she said softly. "It's time to feel again." The world outside the mansion felt immense and unpredictable. Rainwater pooled around their feet, and the children splashed in it without hesitation, chasing each other and laughing. Blake's carefully constructed world had collapsed, leaving only the messy, chaotic, beautiful pulse of life. And then the unexpected happened. A small slip on the slick stone path sent Somi tumbling, toppling into Blake's arms. Without thinking, Blake caught him, spinning him around. "Got you!" he cried, and Somi squealed with delight. Grace joined in, scooping Sonia into her arms, twirling her so that the girl shrieked with laughter. The twins, Blake, and Grace moved in a rhythm that was not choreographed, not planned. It was alive. Blake looked at Grace, at his children, and the truth hit him with full force. All his years of control, structure, and wealth had been meaningless without this. She had taught him something no blueprint ever could. "Thank you," he whispered to her, voice cracking, "for saving them, for saving me." Grace's eyes glistened in the fading light. "You didn't need saving," she said softly. "You just needed to remember how to live again." Blake reached for her hand, hesitating for a long moment before entwining his fingers with hers. The connection was simple, profound, unspoken. They didn't need labels or contracts. They only needed trust. The twins, seeing the gesture, ran between them, squealing with delight, and Blake laughed. A deep, unrestrained sound he hadn't made in years. Sonia grabbed Grace's apron, looking up. "Mama G." Grace bent, hugging her tightly. "Yes, sweetheart. That's me now." Blake knelt beside them, catching both children in his arms. He felt their warmth, their tiny hearts beating against his chest. The storm had passed, but the house, the family, was finally awake. Later, back inside the mansion, chaos filled the rooms. Blocks toppled, paint smudged the floors, and the twins giggled uncontrollably as Blake attempted to blow bubbles clumsily alongside Grace. Somi squealed when a bubble popped on his cheek. Sonia burst into laughter, chasing after the floating spheres. Blake collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but alive. Grace sat beside him, brushing stray hair from his forehead. The twins clambered onto their laps, and for the first time, Blake didn't try to plan, control, or fix. He simply was. In the living room, the sun peeked through the clouds, illuminating their mess of blankets, toys, and laughter. Blake glanced at Grace, her face soft but radiant with the serenity of someone who had always known life's fragile beauty. You know, he said, voice barely audible over the twins' laughter. I thought perfection was the answer. I see now, it's this. Chaos. Life. Love. Grace smiled. Exactly. And as the children squealed, ran, and tumbled through the room, Blake understood fully. The fortress of his life had been replaced by something infinitely greater. A home of love, trust, and soundless laughter, messy and alive, held together not by rules, but by hearts daring to beat together. Sonia clapped her hands. More bubbles, she cried. The mansion, once cold and clinical, now breathed with life. And in that imperfect, beautiful moment, Blake Volt knew. They were no longer a family fractured by grief. They were reborn, chaotic, alive, and unstoppable. Thank you for listening, my wonderful family. I hope you enjoyed the story. This is a reminder that love and patience brings healing, greater than any amount of money could buy. Kindly subscribe to this channel and leave an encouraging comment down below. I am reading every comment, as hearing from you all warms my heart. Tune in again tomorrow because I have another touching and inspiring story for you. Goodbye for now. The mansion, once cold and clinical, now breathed with life. And in that imperfect, beautiful moment, Blake Volt knew. They were no longer a family fractured by grief. They were reborn, chaotic, alive, and unstoppable. Thank you for listening, my wonderful family. I hope you enjoyed the story. This is a reminder that love and patience brings healing, greater than any amount of money could buy. Kindly subscribe to this channel and leave an encouraging comment down below. I am reading every comment, as hearing from you all warms my heart. Tune in again tomorrow because I have another touching and inspiring story for you. Goodbye for now.